There are over 390 islands within the Juneau Borough, 6 glaciers, 177 mountain peaks, and over 300 miles of coastline, which gives way to 19 rivers. American geographers referred to it as an island chain. If you spoke Italian, you might call it an archipelago. If you're from the United Kingdom, you'd call them isles. The names which we've recorded for landmarks in Southeast Alaska are derived from 40 different nations on 6 continents. On January 16, 1889, Captain Lester Beardsley charted 24 newly discovered terrain features as he entered the northern canal of the Inside Passage. Cohen Island, named for a Juneau resident and deckhand of the surveying vessel. Vanderbilt Reef, named for Captain L.W. Vanderbilt, who piloted the vessel. Aaron Island, in memoriam for Captain Vanderbilt's late nephew. Favorite channel, simply named after the survey vessel itself. Shelter Island, for the secondary survey vessel.
There's a pride in being able to name something that has never been named before, that I know from my experience, my Western experience. It wouldn't surprise me if the same applies for just anybody, you know, having a mountain named after you, or a waterway named after you, or a road, or whatever. It says, oh, well, you know, that road was named after me, you know, or was named after my family.
From 1844 through today, the U.S. Geodesic Survey has logged over 200,000 names for Alaska's terrain. Like most American place names, they're biographical, memorializing explorers, politicians, and cultural icons.
People have assigned and continue to assign names to features. Names of the folks who financed their expedition, names of their political leaders, names of their crewmen, names of their spouses, children. Sometimes they attempted in their best efforts to listen to what the residents of an area said was the name and record it as best they could.
Some of the more attentive of them recognized the value of indigenous names because they were very descriptive, and of course they were known by local people. So they documented names like John Muir or others, and some of them went out of their way not to, and to put European or Anglo-American names on top of them.
By 1950, the population of Juneau had reached 10,000 and was growing fast. Across the channel, on Douglas Island, the development of Alaskan lands are about to go a bridge too far. Waiting until the Taku Kwaan left for seasonal fish camp, the Douglas City Council voted to remove the remaining Tlingit homes, which stood in the way of the mining town's expansion.
The Taku Kwaan a lot of the people had houses there, and they set up a village, and you can clearly see it in the historic photos. You can clearly see it back in the early sandboard maps of the 19 teens, and they were right there next to the Treadwell mining operation. City of Douglas kept working to condemn all those properties and tear them down so that they could then clear that area for recreation, for a park, and for ball fields. There's an article from the May 7th Empire paper, and the tone of it was as if it was kind of a fun event, and these were people's houses that were burnt.
The demolished beachfront was known by one name for all of recorded history, Anak Ya Andeganye, where the sun rays first hit. But following the construction of Treadwell Mine, the Tlingit name was forgotten and became known as Edwardsville. And then a short while later, George Vancouver's journal editor, John Douglas, wrote his name onto the charted but unnamed island. Finally, as 40 years of earth and ore piled up behind the impact mill, it simply became known as Sandy Beach.
This would have been one of the last houses in 1961 of the Tlingit Indian village, as they called it. And then these 10 structures were the ones that were once again condemned, burnt, and then bulldozed as the Douglas City Council built a boat harbor and a park and the ball fields you see today.
But none of this would be acknowledged until the expansion of Gastineau Elementary School in 2012. During the construction of Douglas schools and neighborhoods, Taku Kwaan cemeteries were exhumed, and other grave sites were simply poured over with concrete.
You can see in the shade of these trees, and you can see the depressions. This is the area that was called the Native Cemetery or Indian Cemetery. In Douglas, there were a series of different ethnic and church kind of cemeteries.
As construction crews worked to renovate the 60-year-old school, the headstone of a Kwaan tribesman and remains of a young woman were unearthed.
It's kind of disturbing. You know, it just shows you how profound the institutional racism was. And there were federal documents at the very same time that they were proposing to build the school from Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, if you have to build a school and choose a place, and if the only place that really looks good is over native grave sites or burials, that's probably okay.
The song said, "Weep no more, weep no more. It will have an impact on the earth if we weep and continue to grieve and continue to hurt." And so this poll, what is being raised here in a little bit, is so that we will stop our weeping over the kinds of things that happen to us, my grandchildren, on this land. Fight no more, war no more, war no more, war no more.
The totems, which preserve Tlingit clan history, serve as a reminder to future generations of the events that carve their lives today. Healing poles are erected on land to signify the end of a trauma and the beginning of a new life.
one of the ways they acknowledge what had been done is to change the name. And what the school board settled on is Sayéik Gastineau Community School. Sayéik refers to Douglas in general, kind of more encompassing name for the Douglas area, which kind of refers to spirit helper.
The Sayéik on its own is a spirit helper, and it's a powerful word in our language. The sa in front of it is like a voice, and so it could be like the voice of a spirit helper and things like that. And so I think it's very appropriate that we take a name like that that's often associated with healing, that's associated with getting some help from the spirit world, because sometimes what we're talking about with people, the land, and their language, and this spirituality is trying to mend these things back together.
Places that originally just had Western or English names now have both. And I think that is a way of decolonizing, if you will, the landscape, but also honoring the original inhabitants of the land.
Sometimes, as Americans, we wonder what our society can offer Native people to sponsor healing and forgiveness after 500 years of assimilation doctrine. Many other core countries in the world have made formal government apologies, such as Canada and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
Australia issued a governmental apology encompassed within the Bringing Them Home report, which acknowledged their role in the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their homes and the subsequent deaths in boarding schools.
On behalf of the Government of Australia, I am sorry.
There is much unfinished business, and today's report will guide us on the progress we are yet to make. As our stolen generation's members age, your needs are changing. We'll carefully consider the recommendations.
However, in the United States, Supreme Court rulings prohibit Alaska Natives from suing the government, and despite several attempts, any political apologies have been stricken down in Congress. But the bond that has been created between Alaskan residents and Native people is remarkably younger and stronger than that of other states within the Union. For nearly half a century, Alaskans have overwhelmingly supported the reinstatement of Koyukon Athabascan name Denali to the peak which was temporarily referred to as Mount McKinley. The only opposition to the reinstatement was from President William McKinley's home state of Ohio by Congressman Ralph Regula.
The U.S. board did not consider a proposal, and they still will not consider a proposal when there's pending legislation in Congress. And every year, the senator from Ohio, Ralph Regula, introduced a bill at the start of each new session of Congress that said the name of the mountain will stay.
Agenda item 2, S-155, is a bill to designate a mountain in the state of Alaska as Denali. It is not a mountain, it is the mountain. It is the tallest mountain in North America. The Koyukon Athabascan name for Mount McKinley is Denali.
Finally, in August of 2015, the Department of the Interior Secretary, Sally Jewell, directed that the name Denali would supersede McKinley, in keeping with Alaska's new doctrine to provide preference to Native names on the land. But not all Americans welcome the notion that Native place names are significant.
It's a landmark, and it's an icon, an attempt on the part of the administration to curry a little favor in Alaska.
Other locations throughout the United States, such as Bears Lodge in Wyoming, face a similar debate over why the traditional names of the land should be reinstated.
And Bear Lodge is widely known as a mountain range around here, not a geographic feature. We've all got better things to do with our time than to fight with Native Americans over who really should have the naming rights to Devil's Tower.
There are currently over 700 Native American landmarks pending appeal at the National Board of Geographic Names. In the small village of Hoona, the Kunakuwu have a deep understanding of how names can transform an individual's perception of Earth and place.
So the National Park Service was a partner with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Subsistence Division many years ago, starting in 1992. We partnered with ADF&G and the Traditional Tribal Council in Hoona to gather place names. And then we partnered with the tribe to produce a poster-sized place name map. And then because we wanted our visitors to understand that the landscape was covered with traditional place names long before Glacier Bay was a national park.
When we first moved here, we being all the clans, moved here to what is now Hoona. At the beginning, they named the bay Hoots Bay, which is a bear bay, primarily because there were so many bear here. But eventually, when they settled here, it was discovered that it was a good shelter from the north wind. You know, wind has a lot to do with where people settle. Then this place here, because it was a shelter, became Hoonia. Hoon is the northern, Nia means the leeward side from the north wind.
The natural history within Icy Strait and Glacier Bay reveals a dramatic story of flowing ice that erased Tlingit villages. And as miles of ice retreated back into the fjords, the only artifacts to survive the Little Ice Age are the names themselves.
One of the ones that's still there on the narrows going into Glacier Bay, and they're called Sitaki Narrows, and that comes from the Tlingit name Sit-iti-gei, and that name could be translated as the bay that's taking the place of the glacier, but Muir translated it as Glacier Bay.
The second name for Glacier Bay is Aatlein, and it means among the icebergs. It was a name that was applied to Glacier Bay after the Little Ice Age, when the glacier had advanced and overrun the village in Lower Glacier Bay. It reflects this time period when Lower Glacier Bay was probably bobbing with chunks of ice, and people who maybe returned were weaving in and out of these icebergs.
Those deep histories go back to the end of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Holocene. In the Tlingit oral histories, they talk about sea level changes. And these were recorded by non-native anthropologists and others back in the early 20th century, before Western science really understood about sea level change and that. They recorded elders who said, at one point in time, each year the tide came higher and higher until our villages were flooded.
So it's very powerful that a non-literate culture, a culture without a writing system, could remember names that are thousands, if not tens of thousands of years old.
People who were elders 20 years ago probably had at least 500 place names in their head. And then you had so many fluent people that you had this just cloud of information. And I think what it does is it also, instead of having a paper interpretation of the land, you have the land internalized inside you. There's a landscape inside your mind that has these names, has these landforms, and that has also a narrative of people who've been here for 15,000 years.
The place names preserve this record of land occupation and use. There's a historical element here. It's the history of a people. that have lived on this land for a long, long time and want to see that history recognized and maintained.
And so to not acknowledge that name is a rejection of the identity and the relationship of the land and the people.
Still today, there are endless submissions to the Alaska State Historical Commission to petition the naming of terrain features. In Juneau, the recent death of a local state employee prompted family and friends to name a peak Mount Scribner to immortalize their late loved one.
This particular case, it wasn't really a conflict. It was, it had come to the attention of some of us who work in place names that someone had an idea to put somebody's name onto a mountain, which is in a lot of ways how you might honor somebody. And so one of the opportunities that we saw was to say, oh yeah, that mountain already has a name. It's Tlingit.
According to all state and federal records, the mountain was unnamed. But Lance Twitchell's appeal to preserve the Tlingit name was supported by all, including the family of John Scribner. The efforts made by regional tribal associations and heritage institutes to preserve these ancestral toponyms has a deeper underlining effort. In 2018, Alaska declared a linguistic emergency due to the rapid loss of native languages across the state. By returning these names to the land, native languages have been given a revitalized voice.
I could say Sayéik and Chak, and I'm saying the names of these things that we've known for over 15,000 years. And we had this one, Kehinuk, John Martin, he said, we're Tlingit because we know those names. Right? And so our identity is gained particularly through a language.
When our elders began to leave us, these were their words. Magawat ko haipan at sa titikong siyak, wa'ewa hajisi kahitan,